Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Today, we talk about one of Wisconsin's favorite spirits, brandy. I reached out to Korbel's master distiller, Paul Ahvenainen, to learn more about how brandy is made and why Wisconsin is so smitten with the drink. Ahvenainen began his career at Korbel in 1985, shortly after his graduation from the University of California at Davis, with a degree in enology. He also spent 2 years working as a distiller for a subsidiary of French cognac producer Remy Martin. I reached Ahvenainen by phone in California, where Korbel's facilities are located. I've never met a distiller before, so I just want to learn.
We're not all that rare, really. I mean, there are people who distill a lot of things in the United States, especially nowadays with the craft distilling movement.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people coming out of the woodwork and learning distilling. Some of them are producing some amazing products, and some of them aren't. But that's the way that always works is when you start with a bunch of innovative new people coming into a business, some of them really get it figured out, and some of them come up with some novel stuff, and some of them fade away.
Yeah. So how is that whole movement of people like homebrewing and just like the craft industry kind of changed what you do at a big brand?
Yeah, we don't feel at all threatened by craft producers. People obviously aren't supposed to be distilling at home. That's highly illegal to do that, not to mention dangerous if you don't do it right. If you're talking about craft beer and people making wine at home, that's obviously been going on for a very, very long time, and that's always been part of the landscape, especially here in wine country. It was routine for our growers to make their own wines and all that kind of stuff. So certainly not a big deal. In terms of the craft distilling movement, I personally, my own take on it is it's nothing but good for us because it brings more interest into the category of distilled spirits. It's not just the same huge brands, duking it out for that one last bit of shelf space left in the vodka section, so they can put their coconut infused whipped cream vodka there, to that last little slot, So, the idea that people are making these handmade, mostly whiskeys and gins and things like that. Not a lot of people doing brandy on the craft. I mean, there certainly are craft brandies, but don't get me wrong. But the majority of the action seems to be in the grain, based spirits. But we see it as just sort of invigorating the whole distilled spirits category, though.
Well, I guess maybe kind of where I wanted to start was to talk about the connection with Wisconsin and Korbel. How important is Wisconsin to the Korbel business? Oh,
it's hugely important. When I talk Wisconsin, I, in general, talk about sort of Wisconsin and Minnesota together because, Minnesota's, part of that whole dynamic. Wisconsin is bigger than Minnesota, but it's, the dynamic there is similar. So those two states, and they're, in terms of population, they're relatively small states, account for about 60% roughly of Korbel brandy production.
So what do you make of the connection? Why is Korbel and just brandy in general so much a part of Wisconsin, Minnesota culture? Do you have an explanation for that?
I don't have a totally ironclad explanation for that. I think the real answer is it's complicated. I know I think a big part of it was back in like the 1970s, and maybe even into the late 60s. There was a big push on Korbel brandy there, with, Korbel working in conjunction with their distributors there locally in Wisconsin. They had a campaign. One was, nickel and drink and worth it, nickel and drink more and worth it. That kind of stuff to try to premiumize it a little bit. I mean, you got to remember this is the 1960s and 1970s. The ad campaigns weren't maybe as silky smooth as they are today. But that was part of it. Part of it is the Germanic, heritage of a lot of the people in the area. They tend to be brandy drinkers anyway, combined with the hard winters and everything. You need a little antifreeze in the system. So I think a lot of those factors kind of came together. And brandy, Korbel is a huge thing in Wisconsin, and I believe it's still the number one spirit in the state of Wisconsin. And the brandy old fashioned with Korbel in it is sort of almost the semi-official state drink. It's pretty amazing. It goes deep, This is probably I want to say at least 5 years ago, probably closer to 10 years ago. I was walking in Madison with our local rep there, and there's a bar there called the Old Fashioned, and we'd been there for a call on the owners, there, and we had a few cocktails and dinner there at the Old Fashioned, and we're walking back to our hotel, and we're walking by there's like display windows in the Wisconsin State Museum, which is right there, and I glanced at the display, window of the Wisconsin State Museum, and there's a Korbel bottle sitting there, and it's like, oh my God, these guys are serious. That it would be in a window display of the Wisconsin State Museum. It had a bottle of Korbel Brandy that probably dated back to the 70s there.
Yeah, it definitely is a serious business in Wisconsin. You must be kind of like a celebrity when you come to Wisconsin. When you tell people what you do, I'm sure you get a lot of free drinks.
Yeah, if I'm there, I'm buying drinks for other people. That's my job. but no, it's kind of cool. Definitely get people turning out, and it's funny because in the rest of the country, it's all about the champagne. The California champagne that we do, and then you go to Wisconsin and Minnesota, and it's all about the brandy. And we heard that you make champagne also, but it's really all about the brandy. It's kind of cool. You walk into one of the large retailers there, and walked into this shop, and they had I want to say it was like 400 case floor stack in the middle aisle of the store. And I'm like, wow, that's enormous. Like, I've never seen anything like that. And this was in January. And our rep said, no, it was 600 cases before the holidays. You should have seen it then. That and the local bars. There's still, one of the things that's really kind of cool about Wisconsin is there's still a very vibrant local neighborhood bar scene. That it's nice to see, that people have their local little bar, in their neighborhood, and that's where they go to hang out with their friends.
So do you have any tips on where you find the best old fashioned when you come to Wisconsin? Do you have a favorite place to get?
No, I really don't. I'm not going to play favorites because somebody's going to shoot me. All the arrows will be slinging from all the others. No, I've had, over the years, I've had numerous, amazing old fashions and other cocktails too. Obviously, made with Korbel Brandy in Wisconsin, and it's cool. It's very, very cool.
So you mentioned there's kind of a difference between for your company's purposes in Wisconsin, Minnesota versus other places. Obviously, in other places, it's more. You said it's more of the champagne. But how do you market brandy outside of Wisconsin? Like, say, how would you market Korbel Brandy in California?
California is the next largest market for us, but it's interesting because it's a Northern California market. We do fairly well, partly because we're a local business here in Northern California, and people know that. So we do okay with the chains and the Safeways of the world and all that kind of stuff. But then you get into Southern California, it's the same state, but it's Korbel's not much of a presence in Southern California for some reason. It's just different. The other thing is that if it's going to come down to a knockdown on price, and nothing but price, we can't win that war. There are a lot bigger fish, in the pond than we are making brandy in the United States, and they have way deeper resources than we have and greater economies of scale than we have, and so we try to position ourselves as more of a premium quality producer. We can't get that last dollar out of that bottle for somebody, It's just, we can't hit that price point of some of the bigger players.
Do you get a lot of visitors from Wisconsin out in California out at Korbel?
We get a few, not a huge amount. It's kind of far away, but we do get a few coming through here. And honestly, sometimes they're a little disappointed because the regulations in California do not allow tasting of spirits.
Oh no.
Yeah, so if they do come here, we can taste them on the champagnes, but we can't taste them on the brandy. It's interesting because California just recently passed some revisions to those regulations, allowing some of the small craft producers, the real small guys, to do tastings. But those rules did not apply to anybody making. I can't remember what the threshold is, but anybody making a reasonable amount is not allowed to do tastings, which is kind of too bad because it'd be nice for people to be able to try it, just a little tiny sip in the tasting room.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you take me through the brandy making process? How does it come together?
Sure. Are you familiar with how distillation works in general?
Not so much.
Okay. All right. Well, let's back up all the way back to what is distillation. Distillation is basically taking a liquid. Doesn't actually have to be a liquid, but in this case, we'll say it's a liquid. Taking a liquid with multiple components in it and breaking it apart into its components based on heat and the boiling point of those components. So, if we ignore everything else in wine other than water and alcohol. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of other things in wine other than water and alcohol. But if we ignore all that for a while and just say that, wine is a mixture of alcohol and water, those two liquids have different boiling points. The boiling point of alcohol is lower than the boiling point of water. So it takes less energy to boil alcohol than it does to boil water. So now if I have this pot with a mixture of water and alcohol in it, and I heat it up, what's going to evaporate off first? The alcohol, right? So, when you distill generally at pretty low alcohols with the wine that you start with. Let's just say it's 10% alcohol. And you put it into an old-fashioned pot still, like would have been used in cognac or it would have been used by a craft distiller today, possibly making whiskey or whatever. Okay. And, you put, let's say, put 500 gallons into that pot, 500 gallons at 10% alcohol, and you boil off half the volume. You're going to end up with about 250 gallons at about 30% alcohol. And then if you put that back into the pot and distill it again, heat it up again, you're going to end up with something that's around 140 proof, just 70% alcohol by volume in two distillations. Okay? So that's the way an old-fashioned pot still works. A column still, or what's called a continuous column still, which is what we use and the vast majority of anybody making more than a couple thousand cases a year use, is a continuous process that takes the same principles. You have this column. It's basically a large tube. Roughly ours is about 6 foot in diameter, and there's a bunch of copper plates in it, and the copper plates have holes in them. And you inject the wine into the middle of the still, and it starts flowing down through the holes in the plates for the bottom of the still. And then there's a heat source, which is usually live steam, at the bottom of the still. And as the wine gets closer and closer to the heat source, it gets hotter and hotter. So the alcohol boils. The vapor from the boiling alcohol can go up through the same holes that the wine is coming down through. So you got vapor going up, you got liquid coming down. And it, pauses a little bit on each plate, just because there's a layer of liquid built up there. And so, the higher you go in the still, the more alcohol you have, and the lower you go in the still, the less alcohol you have. And at the very bottom of the still, you pull out water and slops, whatever's left over, because obviously wine is not just alcohol and water. You pull out the slops and the water at the bottom, and at the top of the still, depending on how you run it, you can run brandy at, let's say, 150 or 160 proof, or you can run vodka at 190 proof, or even 195 proof. So depending on how you run that still, you can make something that has the flavors of brandy, by keeping the proof relatively low, or you can make it completely neutral, or very, very neutral anyway, and make a vodka-like product. And there are people making, vodka out of wine. Ciroc is probably the best-known brand for that. It's a French product.
So generally, how long does the process take?
The distilling itself?
Yeah.
The winemaking is very basic white winemaking. There's not a lot of steps to it. You don't have to filter the wine. You just basically ferment the wine. You clean it up a little bit. You don't even need to filter it. And then when you're ready to distill it, the distillation, goes fairly fast. If you have a column still, on a pot still, when I used to work for a subsidiary of Remy, it would take us 24 hours to make 250 gallons of 140 proof product. And our still, for the brandy column runs at closer to about 1,000 gallons per hour. So it's a considerable difference.
Are the grapes like kind of the same that you would make a typical wine with, or is there like a different quality or a different kind that you're looking for to make brandy?
Yeah, there's some pretty big differences. First of all, when you make brandy, you're because it's not just water and alcohol. There's a lot of esters, which are aromatics. There are a lot of alcohols other than ethanol. There are all kinds of flavored materials in wine, and some of them distill over and some of them don't. Something like tannins, like in a Cabernet, those do not distill over. They stay in the slops, at the end of the distillation process. But something like the aromatics, the esters, they can distill over. And for a lot of the sort of the premium varietal wines, they become obnoxious when you distill them. They don't taste particularly good because you're over concentrating some of those aromatics. Something like a Cab or a Merlot does not distill well. Even a Chardonnay does not distill that great. In the premium varietals, the one variety that distills pretty well, but it's very pricey, is Pinot Noir. Tends to distill very well. A lot of brandy in California is made with a variety called Thompson Seedless, also known as Sultana. It's a very neutral variety. We don't use a lot of that. For Korbel, it's not a variety that I'm a huge fan of because it's too neutral. But what we do use is a lot of French Colombard, some Chenin Blanc, and then we also do use some red varieties, which we actually make into blush wines and then distill those blush wines. We do make some wines out of like Carignan, Zinfandel, things like that.
So now talk to me a little bit about the aging process. How does that work with brandy?
Legally, to be, brandy in the United States, for domestic production, like, European producers have different set of rules. But for domestic U.S. production, you have to take the distillate and age it in oak barrels, specifically in oak barrels, for a minimum of 2 years. So the minimum age is 2 years, and you can go whatever you want beyond that. In reality, all brandy producers are blend of multiple different years. It's a blend of ages. In the case of Korbel, we use once used bourbon barrels. That is what we bring into the Korbel program, and we buy specifically from one very large, or I should say, whiskey barrels. Not bourbon barrels, but we buy from one particularly very large Tennessee whiskey producer who we're kind of sort of affiliated with because of our marketing connections with their ownership. And that has actually become very much a part of the Korbel house style. A brand new, right out of the cooperage, oak barrel is actually too strong for brandy. It just really would knock you on your tail with the punch of the oak. Like if you talk to folks in Cognac or Armagnac, or they make some pretty nice brandies in France, they put their newest wood into their cheapest blends. The XOs and the specialty blends, those are never aged in new barrels. Oftentimes the barrels can be, dozens of or even, decades old. Because, the new oak is just too harsh. And if you're going to age for a long time in wood, like for some of the exo type products, then that is really going to be problematic. What works well for us is we take those used whiskey barrels and we actually use them a few times.
Yeah, how many times is it, like 2 or 3 cycles that you use them, and then you get? Yeah,
about 3 cycles typically, and and we always check the barrels to make sure that they're still in good integrity and all that kind of stuff, and then there's a market for them as planters after that, and so et cetera.
Do you ever have craft beer brewers try to get your barrels?
Oh yeah, we have worked with a few people over the years in terms of doing things with used brandy barrels. Yeah.
What's kind of the reason that they would want to get a Korbel barrel?
There's just a little, because the wood is of course a porous material, so a little bit of the brandy soaks into the wood, and when we ship them the barrel, the barrels are obviously emptied, but there's still brandy soaked into the wood, and I think that it just plays nicely with some of the beers.
Have you ever had any of the beers that have been a result of from using those barrels?
I have, but it's been a long time. I can't even remember the name. It was in Wisconsin. I wish I could even remember the name of the brewery, but I have had some, and it was pretty interesting. It was a nice beer.
Is it kind of interesting to see how there's like a whole barrel market these days?
Oh yeah, the barrel market is very tight. Because there's a lot of interest amongst small distillers, and also there's a lot of demand in Europe for the once used barrels.
So it's nice that you have a pretty strong relationship with this place in Tennessee.
Yep. Even still, we still have to pay full freight for them. We don't get any freebies, so we're still paying good money for them.
Can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got to become a master distiller?
My own background, I was studying biochemical engineering at UC Davis, and in reality, I'm kind of a hands-on guy, and that was just a little too theoretical for me. I wasn't totally happy with where that was all going. Because I like to pick up a wrench or a hammer and, do things with them, build stuff. So my grandfather was actually a microbiologist, and he wanted me to pay a courtesy call to one of his colleagues at UC Davis who was in the wine department. And, so, here I am, I'm like 18-year-old kid, freshman in college, it's like, yeah, okay, fine, grand, I'll whatever you say, So I went and I met this guy. He was a microbiologist and worked in the winery side of things. Had a very fascinating conversation, and the fact of the matter is he kind of talked me into he was getting ready to retire, and he was going to teach intro to winemaking one last time. And so he talked me into taking the class, and I found it fascinating. I really thought it was a really, really interesting class. And, obviously it was an intro class, and largely it was, non-science people that were in the classroom. But I found it to be really interesting, and the following year, I kind of moved myself over there, and I got into the brandy thing because one of the professors there needed a teacher's aide in the distillation class. And, I somehow, I don't know exactly how it happened, but my hand went up and I volunteered to do it, and then next thing I know is I'm working for Remy, I worked for them on a subsidiary that they're California subsidiary of theirs. They were trying to get up and going in the early 80s. Did a couple of years for them. Remy decided not to do that project on a big scale. And at the same time, Korbel was, looking for somebody. And they were actually looking for somebody on the champagne side, not the brandy side, but I didn't know that. So, I just went ahead and applied for the job thinking it might be a brandy job. And it wasn't. It was a champagne job, but it was so rare for them to have anybody interviewing with brandy background that they said, hey, we got to hire this guy. And so that's it. From there, that was in 1985. My first full-time day on the job was April Fool's Day, 1985.
It sounds like you kind of just fell into it a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And which is great. That's the way life should be,
Can you tell me a little bit about some of the other products? We've been talking a little bit about champagne, but some of the other products that you work on at Korbel?
Sure. Well, we work on, of course, Korbel, Brut, and Extra Dry are the lion's share of the production here. But we make a lot of other sparkling wine flavors. Rosé has been hot lately. We make a couple of different rosés. We actually make 4 different blush wines, but as far as, out there in the marketplace, what you see is we have a Brut Rosé, which is medium dry, and then we have something we call Sweet Rosé, which, guess what? It's sweet. Those have been both very successful products for us in the last decade or so. And we made the Brut Rosé for many, many, many years, but the Sweet Rosé is relatively new, about maybe 7 or 8 years that we've been making it. It's very interesting because they sell in very different markets. We sell a lot of the sweet rosé in like Heartland State, in the Midwest and places like that. And on the other hand, it doesn't move very well in some of the coastal big cities like San Francisco or New York. But the Brut Rosé does well there. So it's different flavor profiles for different parts of the country, really.
You make a number of different brandy products as well. Some just a little bit higher quality than the others.
Yeah, we have the Korbel Classic, which is the lion's share of the 300,000 cases or so that we produce. And then we have a Korbel VSOP, which is made in a very similar way as Korbel Classic. In fact, there's no differentiation at the front end of the process. But what we do is we tend to select bolder, more barrel character there. The idea is that the Korbel Classic is very smooth and a well refined brandy. But a few years back, when cigars were a real big thing, one of the comments we heard from people that enjoyed cigars is that the Korbel Classic really wouldn't hold up to a cigar, that wasn't powerful enough flavor. And so what we did is we made a selection of barrels which had a more power to them, more low strength to them, and also changed the way we do the mix of the wood. We used a little bit of French oak at the very end of the process to give it a little different, a little bit of vanilla kind of flavor to it from the wood, not from artificial vanilla. And that created the sort of the VSOP level. Then we have Korbel XS, which is exactly the same base brandy as Korbel Classic. There's no difference whatsoever. It's the same exact blend as Korbel Classic. But then we do add flavorings to it. We add a natural vanilla to it, a natural orange, and a natural spice mix to it, and some cane sugar. And so it's a little bit sweet. It has the floral characteristics of that, the orange, and it has that unctuousness the vanilla has, and then just a little zippiness in the spice, in the finish. And so that's also something that sells pretty well in Wisconsin, and it's just a different twist on the cocktails. If you make something with Korbel Classic and you make it with the Korbel XS, it's just a little different experience, a little bit sweeter. And then we do have a 12-year-old brandy, but it's in very limited distribution.
One thing I did want to ask about, like the aging process. Now, is there like a point where you don't want to age it anymore? Is it like, is 12 years kind of the limit, or 15 years, or can you go like 50 years? I mean, what's kind of the standard?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of different factors involved. Number one is, can you afford it? You have the time value of money, but in addition to that, you have evaporation going on. You've heard of the angel share, perhaps? It's normal in spirits, whether it be brandy or bourbon or scotch or whatever, that you get a certain amount of losses through the pores of the wood and around the bung and things like that. Typically, it's around 4% or so per year. If you do the math, a 12-year-old barrel, you've lost half the barrel. So not only did you sit on your money for 12 years, and you lost half of it. So that's why the highly aged products, are very expensive, because, you've got the cost of production, you're sitting on top of that cost of production, and then, oh, by the way, you lost a lot of the volume. And then from a flavor standpoint, it really, really depends on the product. The whole oak issue becomes an issue, because if you are aging for a very long time, the oak can become overly dominant. And if you're going to pay a lot of money for a long-aged spirit, You don't want to just taste like oak barrel. You want to taste the whiskey or the brandy or whatever it is. So yeah, there's some limits there, and I think like the whiskeys tend to be there tends to be more long-term aging on those than there is on brandies. It's just a little bit different product.
For people who don't drink a lot of brandy, they might not understand the initials that sometimes are on brandy bottles, like VSOP. Could you maybe detail some of like what those initials mean?
Well, first of all, it's very confusing because it means different things in different places. I don't remember the exact French regulations, but the term VSOP, for example, in France, there's a certain minimum age that it has to be. I believe it's around 5 years or so. And there's certain other, minimums that they have to make with that. But those rules don't apply in the United States. So if we put the VSOP or, one of our competitors, a domestic brandy producer puts VSOP on a label, that has no legal meaning. So there's a ton of confusion out there because of the designations. And honestly, sort of the, VS, VSOP, XO thing, to a large degree, I mean, it's still there, but I think a lot of the producers, because of the confusion issue, they've gone with other terminologies and come up with proprietary terms that describe their products, because there is so much confusion in the marketplace as to what they really mean.
You've been doing this a while now, since the 80s. How have you seen like brandy consumption trends kind of shift?
Honestly, other than in like the Wisconsin and Minnesota area, there's been a bit of a doldrum on brandy recently. The last couple of decades even, there has not been a huge amount of excitement in the brandy business, but I think that's beginning to change. I think that, as people get into some of the classic cocktails and as the craft spirits movement, develops, I think people are going to rediscover brandy, and a lot of the flavors that are there are very conducive to making, some of these old-fashioned type cocktails. Or by old-fashioned, I don't mean the old-fashioned, but I mean sort of like retro-style cocktails. I think brandy's going to, be a bigger part of that, and I think it's just, these things go in cycles, just like clothing fashions do. It's the same thing with the spirits, and I think that. And then brandy's probably about due for an uptick here.
So you mentioned earlier that you've been to Madison, you've come to Wisconsin probably fairly regularly. Can you tell me a little bit about what you do when you come here? Like what kind of activities and what you're trying to do as far as helping distribute your product here?
Well, obviously, we're working closely with our distributors in Wisconsin there and visiting with them and making sure that they're, aware of what we're going up against. I'm a production guy. I'm not good at standing there, in front of a group of people with a bunch of charts talking about price points and, how many dollars you get off if you buy so many cases. I don't do that very well, So, my role is really to talk about the product, especially if we have something new coming up. And then we go visit key retailers, people in the industry there. Just be a presence. Sometimes we're at various events where they can be public tastings, or they can be more societal kind of things like fishing tournaments, etc. In fact, I'm sitting here in my office, and I'm looking at a tip up for ice fishing. So that's a big part of the sort of that Wisconsin wintertime culture is the ice house and going out on the lake and hey, we're definitely part of that.
Can you tell me about the first time you came to Wisconsin?
I think the thing, I can't remember what year it was in. It's been a long, long time. But I just remember that, wow, this place is really serious about the brandy thing, And I just I wasn't accustomed to how seriously Wisconsinites do take their brandy. I'm not a very public persona. I'm certainly no rock star type. But, you come in there and you're almost like this semi-celebrity kind of thing there, and it's like, what? Why would anybody care?
So what would you say is your favorite part of your job?
Well, really the favorite part of my job is I work with great people. Here, in Guerneville, where we do all the blending and bottling, and our folks, I don't know if you know that we actually distill and barrel age at a separate facility. It's not here in Guerneville. So in fact, I was just there last week at our distillery, which is down near Bakersfield in the Central Valley. So go down there and hanging with them and tasting with them, and it's the people part of the business that's the best. And the same thing, when I do go out on the road, it's talking to the people that sell our product, talking to the sales reps, talking to the distributors, talking to the retailers, the people who own the bars, and great conversations with them. Learn all kinds of cool stuff from people.
So I know you're in California, and just to put people's mind at ease, since there are some fires going on, Korbel is located in Northern California, right, where you're pretty much safe from the fires?
Yeah, we had our own fires here in October, though. Those wine country fires that you heard about in October, that was just down the street here. Not particularly close to Korbel, several miles from Korbel, but we have at least a dozen people who work here at Korbel who lost their homes in the October fires. So it's very much a very real thing to us, and we're watching what's going on down in Southern California and thinking, oh my God, here we go again. Personally, I don't know anybody who's affected by the Southern California fires, but I'm sure it's every bit as devastating to them as what up here. I mean, we lost 6,000 homes in Sonoma County, and that's huge. It's mind-boggling, especially in a county that was already pretty heavily impacted on housing front. This is a very high cost of living area here in the wine country because people want to live here. So housing was already expensive and hard to come by, and now it's unobtainable and just not there.
Do you know a lot of people in the winery business or liquor business that have had problems with their grapes being burnt, or what's kind of
that has been kind of overplayed, to be honest with you. In fact, I was just at a breakfast meeting this morning with some people, and we were talking about that. And, here, we all, lived through the smoke and all that, and went through everything. And first of all, the fires were in October, and the majority of the harvest was already in. The really heavily smoke-affected areas are pretty limited. To put it in perspective, you look at some of the news stories, and, you'd see these, fires at the edge of vineyards and, vines burning and stuff like that, and you think, oh, my God, the whole county's gone, Less than 2% of the vineyards in Sonoma County were destroyed by the fire. Less than 2%. And most of them were, in fact, the vineyards worked as a fire break. Several of the very serious fires, they would burn through the brush up in the hills and go through the houses that were up in the hills, come down to the base of the hill where there's a vineyard, and the fire would go half a dozen rows into the vineyard and stop. Because it was a natural fire break, because, the soil is tilled. The vines obviously can burn, but they're green growing because they're watered, so they're irrigated. So it was just a natural fire break that made a already devastating situation could have been much worse if it wasn't for some of the vineyards. But as far as wine quality, I've heard people say, oh, we're not going to buy 2016 or 2017 wines in that area. BS. I mean, the vast majority of the wines are just fine. There may be some individual wines that have a little smoky character to them. But in the modern age of being able to do all kinds of cool things, there are companies that already, Australians have dealt with this problem for many years, and they've discovered techniques on how to get rid of smoke taint in Australia, and we got people here in California that are every bit as smart as they are, and can do the same thing.
Well, we're glad that it hasn't been too rough on the brandy there in California.
Yeah, no, the brandy stuff had nothing to do with the fires at all. The fires are long ways away. I mean, hundreds of miles from where we source our brandy grapes from. So, no problem at all with the brandy production. That is absolutely unaffected by the fires, as is the champagne production, because the champagne harvest starts in late July or very early August and is done by mid-September. So we had finished the champagne program, several weeks before the fires even started. So the champagne program is completely unaffected because of the early harvest.
Do you think there are any common misperceptions about what brandy is, or just brandy the drink?
I think most people don't really know what it is. It's distilled wine. If it just says brandy, it's distilled grape wine. If it lists some other fruit, like distilled apple brandy, then it's made from, apple cider or whatever. But most people don't really know what it is. But it's one of the oldest distilled spirits out there. I think the oldest is probably whiskey-like products. It's essentially distilled. Whiskey is basically distilled beer. So that's probably a little older than wine, distilled wine, but not too much.
What's your favorite way to drink brandy?
Honestly, 90% of what I drink, how I drink brandy is neat. Just in a regular wine glass, about an ounce of brandy in a wine glass, swirl it around a little bit, enjoy it, and then the next thing is the good old fashioned, the Wisconsin old fashioned.
And any special tips that you got from years of practice making old fashions or drinking them?
Yeah, you don't buy the mixers and stuff like that. Use fresh oranges. I like to use raw sugar instead of refined sugar. And hand muddling is key to break up the fruit. And don't make it too sweet. And that's my personal style. In Wisconsin, they like them a little bit on the sweet side. They'll generally make them with a pop, like 7-Up or Sprite or something like that. I personally prefer them a little bit more like a little splash of soda water.
So what do you think is the future of brandy production going forward over the next, 10, 15 years? Do you see more flavored brandies? What's kind of the outlook for brandy?
Well, I think what's going to happen is I think there's going to be more interest in premium brandy, as part of the developments for the maturing of the craft, distilling industry. I think that you're already kind of seeing a little bit of upswell there, and I think that I think there's going to be a lot more excitement. Let me put it this way: I think there's going to be a lot more excitement in the brandy category in the next 10 years looking forward, rather than the last 20 years looking backwards.
How does Korbel? How do you innovate? How do you keep up with kind of the marketplace?
Yeah, we're obviously keeping an eye on it. What we do is a fairly straightforward traditional brandy. We have the XS, which has the flavorings in it. But, as far as Korbel Classic, which is the lion's share of the production, it's a pretty straightforward classic California brandy. And so there's really no need to go mess around with that too much. It's already perceived by people who like it as being a premium product. And it is a premium product. And, we just want to, really it's a matter of getting the category as a whole more energized and getting people more into it. I don't think we need to reinvent Korbel Classic. The folks in Wisconsin in particular don't want us to reinvent Korbel Classic.
Nope.
They like it just the way it is. And they tell us real quick if they think it's changed. They pick up the phone and call if they think something's off. Believe me.
Anything else you want to tell me about Korbel or brandy and what you see is happening in the industry?
Well, we're bullish on the industry as a whole, both on the champagne side and on the brandy side. We know we're a healthy, dynamic company. Things are going along very nicely. Thank you.
Thanks to Paul for taking some time to tell me about his work and teach me about the distilling process a little bit. If you've never had an old-fashioned before, check out the website at whispod.com. I'll post a recipe. It's pretty simple and delicious. And if you have an old-fashioned recipe or story for me, I would love to hear it. You can connect with me on Facebook and Twitter. And if you're not yet a subscriber of the podcast, make sure to sign up on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Cheers.